Welcome, everybody. Good evening. I'm Lee Eastman. I am president of AAUW Naperville Area. I thank you for joining us for this very important program about debunking gun violence myths. This is how we're going to manage the program. Note that everyone will be on mute for the entire program. We will use the Zoom Q&A for your questions. So feel free to use that at any time to submit a question for our speaker. And this program is being recorded. Participant screens names will be hidden in the recording. Elaine Fisher, who is a program chair committee member of our, program committee member is going to monitor the questions for us. And this program is being presented by the American Association of University Women, Naperville Area. I'm very proud to introduce Devin Hughes, who's the founder and president of GVPedia, which is short for Gun Violence Pedia. GVPedia is a nonprofit organization that aims policymakers, advocates, and the public with facts and data to create evidence-based policy to reduce gun violence. Devin?
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. As mentioned, I'm the president and founder of GVPedia, which has been in operation for 6 years. We just had our 6-year anniversary, so we're going on 7 now. And I started back in gun violence prevention after the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012. I was a junior in college at the time, and I was actually in the finance field. My day job is as an investment advisor, managing my own small investment advisory firm here in Edmond, Oklahoma. But that shooting really shook me to the core. And when I started researching the topic, I realized that there's a substantial disconnect between where the public discussion was on one hand and where the academic research was on the other, and that there is a ton of myths out there in the field. And so I started writing on the topic, and more than 10 years later, here I am with GVPedia and continuing that debunking work. And that's going to be the topic of my presentation today. Let me go ahead and share, is debunking gun violence myths. And in particular, I want to debunk the core myth today that's at the heart of much of what's gone wrong in the United States. And that's the idea that guns make us safer. And this core fundamental myth has 4 components to it. One is the idea that defensive gun use is widespread and effective and also beneficial for society. There's the idea that the more guns we have in society, the less crime we're going to have. There's the idea that mass shooters and other people who seek to commit harm target gun-free zones in particular because they know people there won't have access to firearms. And finally, there's the idea that gun laws don't work. And all of these are myths. And I'm going to go through each of them, and then hopefully there'll be plenty of time for a question and answer at the end, because each of these component myths have, frankly, dozens of various other myths that surround and connect with them. So first, before diving into each of the 4 component myths, I want to share some basic data that essentially proves that guns don't make us safer. So having a gun in the home doubles your risk of homicide and triples your risk of suicide. And this isn't the conclusion of just one study. It's the conclusion of a meta-analysis that looked at 16 different studies from more than a decade of research. And the summary of all of those studies was that it doubles the risk of homicide and triples the risk of suicide. And this was a very consistent finding in the research. Further, every time a gun was fired in self-defense, There were 4 unintentional shootings, 7 criminal assaults or homicides, 11 attempted or completed suicides. So it's far more likely that the gun was going to harm a loved one or not protect you at all than was going to be used in self-defense. Again, this isn't just one study, there's multiple studies showing this exact same thing. And in fact, back in the early 2000s, this caused the NRA to attack the CDC for funding studies that were finding conclusions like this. And they went ahead and slashed the CDC's budget by the exact amount that was being allocated to gun violence research, and basically warned them that if you don't stop with these studies, we're going to go for even more funding. And so the CDC had a major decision to make, whether to preserve its existing funding or to continue producing accurate research on gun violence, and it chose to preserve its funding. Now, finally, a couple decades later, that funding ban has been lifted, and so we should be starting to see even more studies in the next few years on these sort of topics. Because when the CDC pulled its funding, it wasn't just about that funding itself, but it was about all sorts of other sources that looked to the CDC for guidance. And once they saw that, oh, gun violence is going to be too political a topic to touch, they withdrew their funding as well. So there's a major drought in research. There's still quality research being done, but it was much less than there should have been. Going back to these stats, for a 1% increase in gun ownership, there's a 0.9% increase in non-stranger homicide. So basically among friends, family, acquaintances, and only a small, insignificant increase in stranger homicide. So this shows that the risk with gun violence isn't from strangers in a dark alley somewhere. It's from people you know, and escalating arguments or domestic violence or situations like that arise, or unintentional shootings in the home. So the problem's not going to be defending yourself against a stranger, it's with people you know. So with that, I want to go into the first of these myths, the defensive gun use myth, which is often shortened to DGU for defensive gun use. And there's a claim that you'll often see that there's 2.5 million defensive gun uses annually, which comes out to something like 6,000 defensive gun uses every day across the country. And if you're wondering, like, wow, I haven't heard of these 6,000 defensive gun uses every single day, well, there's a reason for that we'll get into. But these numbers came from a series of surveys done in the 1990s that would ask people, have you had defensive gun use? And the most prominent of these studies interviewed 5,000 people. And of those 5,000, 66 said that they did have a defensive gun use. And from those 66 people, they extrapolated it to the general population, which led to 2.5 million defensive gun uses. However, there's a massive problem with surveys of rare events. If you ask people, have you been abducted by aliens, in that same survey format, you will find something to the tune of 3 to 4 million who claim not only to have seen aliens personally, but to have been abducted by them. Now, the empirical evidence, and this might be slightly controversial here, for alien abductions is precisely 0 so far. The reason that you get claims like this, and it extends not just to alien abductions and defensive gun use, but asking about any sort of rare event that's statistically rare, so occurring to less than, say, 5% of the population annually, is that you're going to get an overestimate, because there's more opportunities for people to lie and say that something did happen to them when it didn't than the other way around. And so the reality is that we now have empirical data provided by the Gun Violence Archive on how many verified defensive gun uses there are each year. And it turns out that there are around 2,000 verified defensive gun uses. This means that was reported to police or media. Now, there's some defensive gun uses that won't be reported to either the police or media. But the very surveys themselves that provide the 2.5 million number indicate that around half are found out by police. And that means there should be a record of them. And so if you take that half number, that would mean there's around 4,000 defensive gun uses annually, which is a far cry from at the time this was made, 39,000. It's now over 40,000 gun deaths each year, tens of thousands of injuries, and hundreds of thousands of stolen firearms. There's approximately 200,000 firearms reported stolen each year to the FBI, and hundreds of thousands of firearm abusive uses. So the risks and harmful uses of firearms far outweigh defensive gun uses. And in the Q&A, I'm more than happy to go even further into depth on this topic or any of the other topics that I'm going to touch on. Recently, GVPedia released a 30-page report on defensive gun use. So I'm merely highlighting the tip of this particular iceberg. So the next myth I want to address is the idea that more guns mean less crime. And this comes primarily from a study conducted in 1995 that was then turned into a book by the same name, More Guns, Less Crime, that claimed to show that when more people were carrying firearms in public, crime would decrease. And this has been turned into the following meme by the National Rifle Association. It's a very pretty looking graph showing the number of new guns increasing from 1991 to 2012 and the violent crime rate plummeting over that same period. However, the problem with this chart is that it shows the number of new guns, not the rate of gun ownership, because people can own more than one firearm. In fact, when you look at gun ownership over the same time period, as violent crime fell, so too did gun ownership. So you actually had the reverse of this, where you had less gun ownership, less violent crime. But those fewer gun owners were owning more and more firearms instead. And even though that there's the initial study and a little bit of research supporting that initial study, the modern research has moved in the direct opposite direction from the initial claim of more guns, less crime, which was made by a former economist by the name of John Lott. If you want to know more about him, please do ask me at the end. Boy, do I have stories there. But suffice to say, the substantial majority of research now finds that right to carry laws, which weaken concealed carry, because way back in the 90s and before, you had states that either prohibited concealed carry or had what were called may issue requirements, where police could look over an application to carry a gun and reject it because, let's say, they knew that they had visited this guy's house 4 or 5 times before for domestic violence calls, but no charges were ever made. Under a may issue framework, the police would know this person has no business owning a gun, so they could deny the permit. Under right to carry laws, that sort of overview was done away with entirely. And so as long as the person could pass the background check and some basic and very, very basic coursework that oftentimes means you don't even have to fire a gun in order to get a permit, a person could walk in and then be carrying a gun within 4 hours. That transition from May issue to right to carry laws, most of the studies now find that result in substantially increasing crime. Unfortunately, the situation has gotten even worse because we're now moving from right to carry laws, which were bad enough, to permitless carry, where now nobody needs any sort of training whatsoever to go out and carry a gun. And so in my home state of Oklahoma, where I'm still currently located, let's say in the next 2 hours, if I really wanted to, I could go online, find somebody willing to sell me a gun, go into the parking lot of, say, a Walmart, exchange some cash for that handgun, no background check, and then I could legally carry that gun in public, basically wherever I want, with just a couple exceptions. That's where we're at currently, and more than half of the states in the country now have permitless carry. And the research my own organization has done on permitless carry finds that over the 3 years after such laws are adopted, gun homicides increased by 22% versus the national average of only 10%. So basically doubles the increase in homicide. And so you're taking a situation that was already bad, as this describes, and you're making it substantially worse. And that's where we're currently at, unfortunately. It all stems back from this more guns, less crime hypothesis. So while many people probably have never heard the name John Lott, you might be Googling it right now, in fact, or haven't necessarily heard the more guns, less crime hypothesis before. It's had a decisive impact on where our laws have been and are currently going. And that's just one illustration of the power of these myths. Another myth that's quite prevalent is the ideas that mass shooters and those looking to do harm target gun-free zones because they know people there will be defenseless. And you'll probably, or you may hear the claim out there that 94% of all mass shootings in which 4 or more people are killed, there's dueling definitions of mass shootings I can get into in a little bit. But in those mass shootings in which 4 or more people are killed, 94% occur in gun-free zones. Now, the claim 4 years ago was that 98% of mass shootings occurred in gun-free zones. And then after that was 96%, now it's 94%. And what happens, or what's happening, is that the same guy who is responsible for the more guns, less crime hypothesis keeps revising his numbers. And when we did an investigation of his numbers, we found out that there's a massive data error where he was, for a period of 20 years, was counting every mass shooting fatality as an individual mass shooting, meaning that his entire numbers were skewed for the percentage. And so his numbers are completely erroneous and fake, yet have been cited by former President Donald Trump and the NRA and many other legislators in terms of advocating for removing gun-free zones. So if you have a push for schools allowing guns on campus, it's due to the gun-free zone myth. If you have examples of wanting to remove restrictions from businesses being able to prevent people from carrying, that's due to the gun-free zone myth. And the idea that, as one of their memes often shows, that gun-free zones just mean people are fish in a barrel. And yet the numbers show that gun massacres rarely happen in gun-free zones. This is from a book and study by Louis Clarivas, and he found that 84% of mass shootings occur in areas that allow guns. And given that all these shootings are occurring in areas that actually do allow guns, well, where are the good guys with guns stopping these shootings? And the FBI itself has found that roughly 4.4% of active shooting incidents. So these are cases that include mass shootings, but also include attempted mass shootings. Only 4.4% of those cases are stopped by a good guy with a gun. Otherwise, they're stopped by police or the shooter committing suicide at the end, or the shooter being tackled by bystanders. So overall, there's no real evidence to support the gun-free zone myth. Another big one is that the idea that gun laws don't work. And oftentimes you'll see this meme where #1 in gun control, Chicago, #1 in murder and gang violence, neither of which happens to be true. There are states that have much stricter gun laws than Illinois, although Illinois has fairly strong gun laws. And Chicago is not #1 in murder and gang violence. We actually look at cities with the highest homicide rates, and this is a little old, before the pandemic caused all the gun violence stats to suddenly shift. However, it still holds that St. Louis was #1, Baltimore's up there, New Orleans, Detroit, Cleveland, Kansas City, Memphis. And when you look at many of these cities, such as St. Louis, New Orleans, Cleveland, Kansas City, Memphis, these are in red states. And these states pass what are called preemption laws that prevent local ordinances from controlling firearms. And so these cities are basically trapped where they can't do anything to help their own situation. Meanwhile, cities such as Chicago and Baltimore are right on the border or right on highways with weak gun states. And so with Chicago, for example, you'll see something like 30 to 40% of the firearms that are recovered in crimes coming from Indiana, because all criminals in Chicago have to do is hop over the border to Indiana, where there are much weaker gun laws, and it's much easier to purchase firearms for cheaper, load up on firearms there, and then drive back into the city. And there's very little that can be done about that because Indiana has super weak gun laws, and Illinois cannot decide what Indiana's gun laws are. Another case that it's both amusing and horrifying of how this gun trafficking occurs was back, I believe it was in 2015. There was an ATF report that's released each year, and with the state of Arkansas, they found that there was 300 guns reported lost or stolen for that year. They then got a tip the following year that, hey, there's this one gun store in Arkansas that's probably playing fast and loose by the rules. You should really audit them. And so the ATF conducted this audit. And sure enough, to the shock and horror of the gun store, they're like, oh my gosh, we have all these guns that have just gone missing somehow. We have no clue what happened to them. And so for the next year, the number went from 300 to 3,000 guns lost or stolen, all due to one gun store. Now, the ATF is only able to audit approximately 7% of gun stores each year. So imagine if they were actually able to audit something like 33% or 50% of gun stores, just how much higher that number would be. And those guns are then ending up on the streets and being shipped either out of state or in state, because Arkansas has a major gun crime problem as well. And so that's just one sense of how the weakening of the ATF, the weakening of state gun laws next to states that have stronger gun laws, all contribute to this flow of guns onto streets, which make it incredibly difficult for cities like Chicago to actually handle the problem. And the overall data definitively shows that gun laws do make a difference. So this chart is from the Giffords Law Center, and they grade states on A to F, with A being the strongest gun laws, F being the weakest gun laws. My home state of Oklahoma is highlighted in white there. And you see the dotted line across, which is the national gun death rate per 100,000. And aside from Maryland, all of the states in the A category are below the line. Illinois just barely. And then when you look at the F states, you have like Texas and New Hampshire, which come close, or are below the line, but all the others are well above the line. And this just shows the power of stronger gun laws. But unfortunately, they're being weakened across the country with a few exceptions, particularly after the 2022 decision in DC versus Bruin, or sorry, well, just the Bruin case in general. First, he had DC versus Heller in 2008, and then 2022, the Bruin case that helped substantially weaken gun laws across the country. And so, unfortunately, we've seen things get worse since during the pandemic and up through 2021. Fortunately, gun violence has been leveling off somewhat, but the trend's still much higher than it was before the pandemic. So what sort of laws do make a difference? Well, one of the ones I want to call out immediately is audits of gun dealers, like I mentioned with the story in Arkansas. That can make a major difference, and something that if the ATF received funding, it could do. But the ATF has been largely stripped of funding. And in fact, it was for a period of, I want to say, 6 to 8 years, did not even have a head of the ATF, because there's so much animosity towards the organization and the gun lobby just trying to strip away its powers to regulate firearms. In fact, the ATF is prohibited from maintaining a digital registry of firearms, and so they use paper copies still in 2023. And so whenever there's a crime gun that they need to trace, it's to the records room, lifting up boxes and trying to find the precise piece of paper to figure out where it was sold. It could all be digitized relatively easily, even to the point where, like, it wouldn't create necessarily a registry. You just have the digital record, and then once a gun comes up, you type in the serial number and bam, it'll show you where it is. But instead, they have to wade through mountains of paper to find that, and that's on purpose. There's another set of laws called the Tierhart Amendments that basically protected gun stores from the ATF. And the ATF had been making progress with gun stores by basically auditing them and then saying, like, hey, look, you need to change your business practices or we're going to sue and get those changed. And so there's the case of Badger guns, and I believe it was Milwaukee, where before the Tierhart Amendments were passed, violent crime plummeted after the ATF locked down on Badger guns and found that they had bad business practices. Immediately after the Tierhart Amendments were passed, the store reversed its ways, undid all of the stuff that had pledged to do, and guns recovered from there spiked by like 100 or so percent, meaning that just that one gun store was responsible for so many of the crime guns and were allowed to go back to their business as usual. So some of the other policies that have been proven to be effective. One is discretionary permit to purchase. Basically, in order to purchase a firearm, you have to have a license, which is fairly common sense. And you can also attach training to that license and some limited amount of oversight. While the Supreme Court in the Bruin case did strike down the necessary cause for having a fire or purchasing a firearm that states like New York had, discretionary permit to purchase was still allowed. Gun removal for domestic violence convictions and protective orders have strong evidence supporting it. That's currently being challenged in the Rahimi case before the Supreme Court right now. Fortunately, it looks like the Supreme Court's not going to go that far and should preserve domestic violence restraining orders prohibiting firearms. But I mean, with the Supreme Court, who knows? You have child access prevention laws. And here the key is to make sure that those child access prevention laws are strong, oftentimes with the felony penalty, to make sure that people are aware of the law. Because it signals to everybody else that, hey, like, you need to lock up your firearms, otherwise children can get a hold of them. In cases where children do get a hold of unsecured firearms, the parents are held accountable for that. Also, outside of the purview of passing laws, you have community-led programs like Cure Violence and Ceasefire programs that have been shown to reduce gun violence, particularly in urban settings. You can find all of these policies and more at the denveraccord.org, which is a roadmap to reducing gun violence that GVPedia itself has produced. So to go ahead and summarize here and then open it up for any and all questions, because I do love a question and answer portion. There's the myth that defensive gun use is widespread and effective. That's definitively not the case. In fact, using any sort of implement or any other weapon has the same injury rates as using a gun in self-defense. Doing nothing versus using a gun self-defense have the same injury rates. So there's a lot better options, particularly given that the risk guns pose on the other end. You have the idea that more guns mean less crime, but the reverse is true. You have the idea that mass shooters target gun-free zones, yet there's no evidence to indicate this is the case. And finally, you have the myth that gun laws don't work, and yet there are plenty of policies out there that do. So you can learn more at gvpedia.org, and also if you're interested, I would highly recommend subscribing to our Substack, armedwithreason.substack.com. Basic subscriptions are free, and you get a daily newsletter directly deposited into your inbox of choice. And there's a lot of content from various people across the gun violence prevention movement, as well as our own work on this. So with that, I'm happy to answer any and all questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Devin. This has been an amazing, a lot of information to absorb all at once. I have a couple questions while people are typing questions in. I'm not seeing a lot of questions right now, but go ahead, folks, and type your questions into the chat. One of the things that I've read, 63% of Americans believe that guns make them safer. Is that amount of belief in this myth still that high? Or is it higher or lower based on your reading?
It seems to be about the same, which is interesting because around between 30 to 40% of Americans personally own firearms. yet 60+% of Americans feel that having a gun in the home makes them safer. And about 55% believe that more people carrying guns in public will make people safer, which is the exact opposite of what the evidence shows.
Yeah.
And that's the power of these myths. And it's not necessarily that people will have read all of John Lott's work, for example, or Gary Kleck, or the other academics and pseudo academics who produce this disinformation, but it seeps into the public to where you can just have basic encounters and people will be like, oh yeah, firearms make me safer. And a sort of attempt to challenge that's not done properly will just result in the person Googling and going down the rabbit hole of disinformation even further. Where back in 2021, in fact, the CDC itself on its Fast Facts website had a range of, like, I believe it was 80,000 to 2.5 million defensive gun uses on there. And GVPedia, along with Gun Violence Archive and Newtown Action Alliance, went to the CDC and talked with them about these statistics, because the true range should have been like 2,000 to the higher end number, if you even wanted to cite the higher end number. And after talking with the CDC, we were able to get those numbers pulled down to where they just said, look, there needs to be more research, which there does need to be more research on it. But it was just an example of where even the CDC itself had fallen prey to disinformation.
Okay, here's another question. Are women killed more by guns more often than men?
So while a gun causes domestic violence to be 5 times more lethal, men are killed more often than women with guns. It's about, I want to say 80% to 20%. And keep in mind that a lot of, or more than half of gun deaths, it's around 55% or so, are gun suicides. And gun suicides particularly impact middle-aged to older white men. And then when you have gun homicides, like that tends to be younger men, and particularly men, poorer men, the BIPOC communities, particularly impacted by gun violence. And then you have domestic violence, which overwhelmingly impacts women. So, but once you kind of sum all those categories up, men still have higher rates, but having a gun in the home is a definitive risk factor. And I also want to mention that this is just in terms of gun deaths and gun injuries. There's still abusive cases of firearms where we don't really have solid numbers on those, because there's problems with conducting surveys of those. Like the same problems you'd have with defensive gun use, surveying that, you're going to have it with abusive situations as well. We know there's a bunch of abusive cases out there, but we don't know how many. It could be in the range of, or towards women, it could be in the tens of thousands. It could be in the hundreds of thousands annually.
I
don't
think it's
know.
even higher. A
The-
survey information, I believe, from Everytown Research said that 5 million women indicated they were threatened by an abuser with a gun. They weren't killed, but they feared for their life.
Yes,
And then the other side of the coin, some years ago, I read a survey of the number of women who are in prison because the only way they could get out of their abusive relationship was to kill their spouse. So they were incarcerated due to murder, but the killing was related to domestic abuse.
Right. Yeah, so a couple points on that. One, the 5 million number is with the caveats of be careful with surveys, is over lifetime. And so we don't know like how many of those per year, and also in terms of whether like how accurate the survey is. And it's just something with surveys of statistically rare events. Even if the total number is catastrophically high and horrible in terms of the raw numbers, like when it comes to surveys, it's still going to create problems that they just can't get around yet. Two, like that's an excellent point and brings up one of the main hypocrisies of stand your ground laws, which is another one of the gun lobby's type of things where it removes the duty to retreat in a violent situation. Typically under common law, you, in a violent situation, like you have a duty to, if you're able to safely, to back away from the situation, try to diffuse the situation. Stand your ground basically says, if you're threatened, you can start blazing away, basically. But whenever women try to use this to protect against their abuser, very often they're thrown in prison. And those are definitely cases where it's like this, if there's any legitimate defensive gun uses out there, it should be these. And yet very often you see women thrown in prison for defending themselves in that case. So like it's just a double whammy, because as we know, women, or the presence of a gun in the home makes domestic violence 5 times more likely to be lethal. And so not only is it not effective self-defense, but even if you are to use it or attempt to use it in self-defense, you're still likely to go to prison for it, which is just horrible.
Okay, we have another question concerning the stance of criminal background checks. Is that widely done, or does it depend on your state?
So even in states with permitless carry, most gun sales do go through a federally licensed dealer. So if a gun sale goes through a federally licensed dealer, you're going to be doing a background check. And the system is fairly good at catching people. Like it's caught, literally, since its inception, literally millions of people who are prohibited purchasers. Now, most of those cases are not prosecuted because, as it turns out, it's very hard to prosecute somebody for lying on the background check form, because they can be like, whoops, I forgot that I had that felony. Oh, well. And also, like, the number of private sales is likely underestimated, because in large parts of the country, guns are almost a form of currency, to where, let's say I want to buy a new truck, and well, I've got my stacks of unmarked $20 bills, don't ask me where I got them, and let's say I'm a couple grand short, well, I'll throw in my AR-15 and that'll cover it. No background check necessary there, as long as I don't know that the other person is a felon. But how am I supposed to know that? Because most people don't wear like I'm a felon like tattooed across their head. Like, it's basically relying on an honor system there for people who aren't very likely to be honorable in those cases. So while most guns are sold through legal means, there's a vast gray market for guns out there that's made even worse by the number of guns that are stolen each year, which, as I mentioned, is more than 200,000 firearms that are reported stolen. Estimates indicate that could be up to 400,000, because some people don't report stolen firearms, unfortunately.
We have a related question about limiting gun show purchases without a background check?
Yeah, so the gun show loophole is kind of a misnomer, and that's something that the pro-gun side kind of dings people on, is whether it's the gun show loophole. Well, no, it's the private sale loophole. Now, you can definitely have those sort of private sales in gun shows. So as long as you're not in the business of selling firearms, you can conduct a private transfer without a background check. Many of the people who are at gun shows selling guns are licensed dealers, but there's a good portion who aren't. But part of the problem with using the term gun show loophole is it minimizes the problem. It's not just at gun shows, it's everywhere else as well. It's like on the internet where you can just find somebody who's willing to do a private sale and then bam, meet in a parking lot. Like, that's not a gun show sale, but it's certainly problematic. And so I highly encourage people to use private sales loophole rather than gun show loophole.
Right, because there are a lot of family transfers and people who inherit guns from grandfathers or fathers.
Yes, yeah, that's the part of the private sales that are less problematic, to where, let's say, a father buys a gun and then hunting rifle and then passes it down to his kid. Now, hopefully that kid's like 18 or something, but there's cases where this is a related tangent, where there's these products called cricket rifles, and it's like my first rifle, and it's a full rifle meant for people who were kids who are like 5, 6, 7 years old. And there have actually been cases where like a 5-year-old brother will shoot his 3-year-old sister with his cricket rifle. And there's other like junior AR-15s now that are just marketed towards kids. And now, like, it's not necessarily going to be the kid who's going into the gun store and signing his name on the check or something there, but it's going to be the parent transferring that gun. So like the private sales was meant to help family transfers, but it's morphed into something else entirely.
A new question: are men more likely than women to commit suicide by gun use?
Yes. So while the rate of suicide attempts overall, so not just with guns, but with poisoning, hanging, suffocation, and so forth, are about equal to, or even to where women have more suicide attempts than men. Guns are so much more lethal that even though they're around 5% of suicide attempts, they're more than 50% of completed suicides. And men are more likely to be gun owners and have access to firearms. And so men are vastly more likely to commit suicide with firearms. And you can go to use the CDC Wonder tool. It's CDC WISQARS and then Wonder. And you can look through the numbers there because they have all the suicide information broken out into demographics as well. So that'd be a useful source to look into that if you're curious.
Another question: how effective are red flag laws? How can they be improved?
So red flag laws are incredibly effective when they're used and when people know about them. The main problem with red flag laws is most people have never heard of them and don't really know how to use them or who can implement them. So we've seen red flag laws stop potential mass shooters, for example, where the FBI itself has issued a red flag law or used the red flag law to disarm somebody that they felt was a suspect. And so law enforcement is typically the primary source that can use them, but you also have what are called Second Amendment sanctuary counties out there where the sheriffs deliberately say, we're not going to use red flag laws whatsoever. And so if you have that case in that particular county, the red flag law is not going to be effective because it's not being enforced. And that's the case with all of these gun laws. Like, they're only as useful as when they're being enforced. And that's one of the reasons why permit to purchase is so powerful, because it's pretty easy to enforce. Whereas if you only have background checks, where you're going to have the private sales loophole, and even if you close that private sales loophole, it's still going to be a challenge to make sure everybody's complying with it. Whereas with the permitting system, if you want to do a private sale, you can be like, okay, show me your license. And if you don't have that license, then it's clearly going to be a legal sale. And so it just makes things simpler and easier to enforce with that sort of system.
A two-part question. What percentage of men committing suicide by gun have also killed their female partner?
That part,
Do you
it's
know?
going to be, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's low. In terms of percentage, it still happens probably, I want to say around 100 times a year, keeping in mind that there's close to 30,000 suicides. So it still happens, and 100's low. It's probably closer to 200. But if you go to the Gun Violence Archive, they keep track of murder suicides. And also, forthcoming on GVPedia, we're going to have a data visualization tool that can let people look at that. And it's currently in beta testing, but I'm going to take a risk here and see. So right now what it's popped up is basically every case of gun violence within, I want to say this is 10 to 20 miles from eyeballing it, of where I'm located. And you can see up here, there are 515 incidents where 205 people were killed and 415 injured. So if I go ahead and use a different search, let's see if murder suicide's up here. Murder suicide. Let's do from 2014. Victims shot, more than 0 people shot. Save query sentence. Might take a little bit to load because, again, this is beta. Okay. So yeah, I was well off. This is why, this is why this tool is going to be so valuable. From 2014 to 2022, there were 5,292 murder-suicide incidents in the US. So that's over the course of 8 years. So divide that by 8 and you get 650, 660 or so murder-suicide incidents per year. These incidents killed 11,710 people and injured 660, because these are incredibly lethal cases.
Yeah.
And you can also, if you want, zoom into Illinois. I'm not quite sure where Naperville is.
On the west of the suburban Chicago area.
Chicago.
You see Aurora? That's where
Yes.
we.
Yeah, so you can zoom in here, and these are just the murder-suicide cases. So.
And
Yeah.
I don't know, would they include, there are many young men that have been involved in mass murders and then commit suicide in a combination event.
So if we wanted to look
Would
at
they
that,
be included in this?
no, murder-suicide tends to have the domestic violence component. Now, if, let me find Illinois here. We wanted to do 4 more people shot. Do any type of shooting, Illinois, say query sentence. These are the various mass shootings. There have been, from 2014 to 2022, 197 incidents, is 176 people killed and 1,044 injured. In fact, I think yeah. So
This looks like an excellent resource. Another quick question as we're running out of time. The NRA, of course, is very powerful, and we're always looking at ways other than expanding our understanding. How can we combat their influence on legislators? And a secondary related question, is there a quick way of finding out which legislators pretty much have been bought and paid for by the NRA through their contributions campaign-wise?
to answer the second first, I believe if you Google NRA campaign contributions,
I know in Illinois we have the sunshine law that
yeah.
does reveal the source of funding for every politician.
So if you look at NRA campaign contributions to the legislature, the first link is list of congressional candidates who receive campaign figures. United Against Gun Violence from Brady, which senators have benefited the most from NRA money. There's Open Secrets. So yeah, there's a few
Right.
sources out there that are ready.
Okay.
And then in terms of countering the influence, like, it's hard because on one hand, if you go into closed door meetings with many of these legislators, they'll tell you like, hey, look, I agree with you. Permitless carry laws are crazy. We shouldn't do them. But if it comes up for a floor vote, I'm going to have to vote for it because I fear the consequences of getting primaried. And so for somebody who's already kind of bought and paid for, as it were, it's going to be super challenging once they're already in office to change their minds. Now, one thing that we've developed is a project on countering the fire hose of falsehood, which is how best to counter these myths in practice. And we have a fact sheet, guide, white paper, even a short video on it. And basically, the fire hose of falsehood needs to be countered at both the personal level and the strategic level. So there's a lot more things that organizations themselves can do to help counter this tactic. But the personal level is just having conversations with people, and not the sort of conversations where you go onto Twitter, or what used to be called Twitter, and start shouting at somebody that they're wrong, but having personal conversations with people you know and you've already developed a sense of trust with, but who might disagree with you, and then listen to them, hear them out, hear why they believe what they do, and have them explain, like, well, how does that work, and what excuse me.
Ask them how they know that.
Right. How do they know that? Where did they get the information? Why do they believe it? And then having them explain that actually helps them realize that, wow, I might not have known as much as